you're surrounded. You can't go anyplace. You're lost. Surrender. Remember what the general said? He sent a note back to the German general with the word NUTS on it. And the general didn't understand it. That's American slang. Nuts, he says. We're not going to surrender. So, meanwhile, we wouldn't have been in that predicament except it was a bad winter. A lot of snow, a lot of clouds, no air cover. They couldn't reinforce the troops very easily with air. So the 101st held the line for several weeks. Meanwhile, they radioed they needed help. Eisenhower realized what he had to do. He took the 4th Armored Division, Patton's crack armored division, the division that led him all across France, and he sent them north 100 miles to relieve the 101st Paratroop Division, and they were successful. We, the 12th Armored Division, were sent to relieve the 4th Armored's position. So we drove north 100 miles to the city of Trier, which is right about here, turned right, and entered Germany, and this all happened in January of 1945, and became Patton's 1st Armored Division to lead all the infantry divisions into Germany. Now all this I read about later. I didn't even know what was going on in the war in those days. Heck, you know, you get a Stars and Stripes newspaper which tells you a few things, but I learned about this all later. It was easy going at first because Germany lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers in that push. They all became prisoners. Most of them were old men and boys. Germany had most of their crack troops in Russia fighting at that time. You've heard about the Battle of Stalingrad. There was another place where the Russians held and fought the Germans off. They never did get into Moscow, never did get into Leningrad. They didn't conquer Russia, and they held them at Stalingrad. So a lot of German troops were tied up in Russia. And Germany was pulling them back in to defend the motherland, you see. They had spread their troops all over Europe, but now they were losing the battle, so they had to get them back. We went across Germany pretty fast in January and February. We were about the middle of Germany coming up to the Rhine. We crossed the Rhine at Worms. And that was a big stumbling block. You can't get tanks across the river. The Rhine River is a huge river. If you've ever seen how big the Sacramento River is when it dumps into the bay, you've crossed over from Vallejo maybe, and see how wide it is. It's as wide as that. Way back here in this area. Imagine how wide it must be up at the mouth of it. There was lots of bridges across the Rhine, but they'd all been destroyed, most of them destroyed by the Germans to defend their own homeland. The Americans captured one bridge, the bridge at Remagen. That was in the 3rd Army area, so they got troops across before the bridge finally collapsed. North of us, that was about 20 miles or 30 miles north of us. So they did have a bridgehead into Germany. But by the time we pulled up to the Rhine, we were at the area of a city called Worms, W-O-R-M-S, Worms, by Monheim and Ludwigshafen, big industrial factories. Monheim is a big industrial city. The engineers had built a pontoon bridge across the Rhine in about 24 hours. Unbelievable. A huge bridge that was on floats. And we were able to defend it and get our tanks across. And we got, within 3 days, we got the whole division across the river right there. The bridge was destroyed. We were paralleling the bridge. And we started then towards the middle of Germany to a city called Birdsburg. W-U-R-T-S, Birdsburg. W's in German are pronounced like V's, Würzburg, you know. Würzburg, which was a beautiful city. 60 miles from the Rhine. On our way to Birdsburg, we were picking up things. The Germans were retreating and surrendering too, by the way, by the hundreds of thousands. And we were guarding them. That was our job as MPs. But we didn't have time to guard them very long. We were usually turning the prisoners over to the infantry divisions, had more men to guard prisoners. And as soon as a German became a prisoner, he was sent as far west as possible and shipped back to the United States. Most of them came back to camps that we had deserted in the South, Arizona. A lot of German prisoners came back. You probably read about those. I don't even know what happened to them, actually. But they got better treatment than they would have gotten in Germany, because Germany was, by that time, devastated. They had been bombed, all their supplies. Their cities were being bombed. Their factories were being bombed every night, every day, day and night bombings. And they were running out of fuel for their trucks and gasoline and everything. Where was I when I detoured?
You were getting to Birdsburg.
Oh, Birdsburg, yeah.
Towards Birdsburg.
We were on our way to Birdsburg. My little group, there were three of us. No, I was with the band, with the military police. There were three of us who were dropped off to, a bunch of Germans wanted to surrender, and they were encircled in a barn. 100 of them, about 100. This was about 10 o'clock in the morning of about March 31st. I remember that so well because it was an important day in my life. And the corporal in charge, we had a corporal and two privates. I was a private in those days because I had lost my rank when I went back to school. But the three of us were guarding these 100 guys that wanted to surrender. And the corporal says, the captain, our captain said, take care of these men until the infantry comes out. The infantry are right behind us, supposed to be following us. We had I didn't tell you about the Mercedes, did I?
Mercedes.
Oh, yeah. A few days before, we had gone by a little house that had a garage and a car, and we looked in the garage, and there was a Mercedes in there. A big German Mercedes, a beautiful car. It was just sitting there. It needed gasoline. That's all it needed. We poured gasoline in the tank, and we liberated it. It became part of our forces, you know. We can use this. We'll need an extra car anyway. So we took the car. There was nobody there, but the civilians had all run away by this time, hiding, fear. I don't know where they were. But we drove the Mercedes, and it was a gorgeous car. It had a windshield between the back seat and the front seat, and a little telephone where the rider could tell the driver where to go and everything, you know. Beautiful instrument, and we used it to help us transport our men. We drove that, and he says, we'll leave the Mercedes with you, three guys, while you guard these 100 prisoners. Well, by 12 noon, a couple hundred more had joined with us, and by the time noontime, a little afternoon came, we had 300. There was only three of us. And these guys who were prisoners, who had surrendered, wanted to go to the bathroom every minute. You know, there was always two or three of them that had to go, or they wanted food, or they wanted to do this. And it was becoming a problem. So the corporal says, take the Mercedes and go back and find the infantry and tell them to take these prisoners off our hands. So I took the car and drove back about 30 miles, driving back the way we had come. And I drove, and I didn't see anybody. There was nobody back there. The fields were empty, the houses were empty, it was deserted. So I finally turned around and came back about half an hour later, and I said to my corporal, there's nobody there. And he says, well, we probably outran the infantry. Why don't you go up to the headquarters of the 12th Armored Division and tell them to send some more men back to help us. And he said they left us a map, and he gave me a little piece of paper where the general or the captain had written out a map of where they were going to go. They're going to drive right into the city of Birdsburg, which is a big town, about as big as Oakland, 100,000 people. And I didn't know it at the time, but Birdsburg had never been bombed, never been touched. It had a big hospital in that town, and with a cross on the top, so the bombers knew it was a hospital. And it was a historic city, a lot of beautiful buildings. It was the capital of a principality in Germany, an area like Alameda County, you know. And so I drove up the road following the map he had drawn, and I drove once I would stop. I had this car with my MP helmet with MP written on it, you know, and my uniform and so forth. And I'd stop and ask somebody, where are the Americans? And I would try to say, well, in German, I'd ask them, or they would speak English. And they'd look at me in amazement. Americans, they haven't seen any Americans. Most of them hadn't seen any. It happened, I found out later, that the division had encircled the town. Rather than going up the road that I'd gone, they had gone around, and they demanded that the general surrender the city. And he refused. I didn't know it at the time. We didn't know it. They didn't know it. But they had a whole company, or maybe a regiment of troops encircling the city. They were going to defend it till the last man. You know how that goes. Hitler had demanded that they do that. The general says, surrender, or we'll call in the Air Force. And they wouldn't surrender, so he telephoned by radio that the Air Force dropped incendiary bombs on the city for the first time. This happened on March 31st. It's a historical event. I've seen it recorded in books, magazines of that event, the first day they bombed Birdsburg. So while I was a prisoner, they bombed it. I was about 15 miles outside the city where they were encircling it. I forgot to tell you that I was driving this Mercedes down the road toward the city, and I looked up and I saw some German soldiers coming down the road about a block and a half away with their rifles on their shoulders and their helmets on. And right away I knew these guys weren't surrendering. They were, because when a man surrenders, the first thing he throws away is his rifle and his helmet. He doesn't want to carry anything, you know. And sometimes, most of the time, his pack and his gas mask, so he's got nothing left. These guys spotted me, and I started to turn around. I better get out of here because I saw soldiers in the forest. I thought they were, at first when I saw them, I thought maybe these are Germans that wanted to surrender, but they were part of the defending forces, I found out later, a few minutes later, because the guys coming down the road started shooting at me when I turned around. They didn't know what the hell a Mercedes was doing coming down the road. There wasn't any other traffic on the road, you know. And by this time, they had pulled a cart across behind me, and I couldn't get out. I couldn't go in the ditch and go into the forest. I couldn't go over the cart, and 8 or 9 soldiers were aiming their rifles at me, and a corporal, German corporal, with the armband that said Crete on it, was standing up and shouting and telling me to halt, get out of the car. And I had a pistol in my pocket, but I had a rifle in the back seat. That's about all I had. What could I do? So I stopped, got out, raised my arms, and surrendered. And that was the most frightening day in my life. I thought for sure that I was going to be killed right that day. And I was frightened. I've never been frightened since, as I was that moment. I always remembered it. And I don't think I'll ever be frightened again at anything as I was that day. But I found soon after that he wasn't interested in killing me, he was interested in capturing me. They wanted to know what was going on. So they took me as a prisoner, took the car, walked me a few blocks to their company commander's headquarters, and started to interrogate me. The captain spoke a little English, haltingly. He wasn't a very good, he didn't know English all that well, so I realized that I didn't really have to answer him, pretended I didn't understand him most of the time, see? Nichts verstehen, I kept saying, until he finally tried to make himself clear. And he didn't want to be embarrassed in front of his troops that he couldn't speak good English, so he didn't pursue it too hard. Pretty soon he started asking me stupid questions, like, well, we were taught, you know, we were never taught how to be prisoners, to tell the truth. We were taught to give name, rank, and serial number if you're captured, that's all. So I did that. I gave them my name and my rank and my serial number, but they wanted to know where was I from? What was MP, military police? What division was I in? And I pretended I didn't understand. I didn't want to give it away. It was the 12th Armored Division, but we had gone in there as an armored division. We didn't want to let them know there was a whole armored division circling them. So finally he turned me over to a guard, and he says, take him down to the general who's in Birdsburg. That was about 1.5 miles away, or 2 miles away. By that time, the city had been bombed by incendiaries, phosphorescent, what do they use? Napalm, not napalm, but if it lands, it burns. Even if it lands on bricks. The whole city was aflame. It's unbelievable. Around 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it was getting dark. The whole city was on fire. And we walked down these streets. Nobody was in sight. The guards took me to the bunker in the middle of town. You know what a bunker is? Yes. Underground bomb shelter, protection place where the soldiers gathered. Down a bunch of steps. And the first thing I heard was a couple of guys down there says, "Hiya, Yank." I thought, who the hell? Who's saying that? It was a couple of Australians who had been captured 3 years before on the island of Crete. Because I spent the day of that evening and that night with them, and I learned all about them. They had been captured as defending the island of Crete 3 years before, and then sent to Germany as prisoners of war. And they worked on the farms as laborers, slave laborers. But they ate well and they lived well until these last few months when they tried to escape from the farms, and they were recaptured several times. Told me they had been put in jail once, and the jail had been bombed the next day, and so they got out again, captured again. And finally they ended up in this bunker in Birdsburg. So there were the three of us, 2 Australians and me. And they were asking me questions. They didn't know that we had millions of troops, really literally millions of troops coming into Germany at this moment. All they'd seen were the airplanes flying over, dropping the bombs day after day. And they said, "Where are you from?" And I told them, I says, "I'm in an armored division. We're circling the city." Well, the next morning, I found that we were assigned, the 3 of us, were assigned to a captain who was going to desert the next day. The general by this time had given up. He knew that he was surrounded. The city was burning all around him. He couldn't defend it anymore. There was nothing more to defend. So get rid of the prisoners. He said, he told the captain, I found out later, he told the captain to take us out in the woods and shoot us. But the captain had other ideas. His name was Captain Eric Ortel. And he decided he was going to desert and go back to his hometown, which was named Bamberg. It was about 40 miles away in the easternly North Division. direction. He got the three of us to pull a cart that he had acquired and filled with goodies he was going to steal from the German army. Goodies, food, sausages, bread, liquor, all kinds of, goodies, cigars, and it was like a U-Haul cart. A small U-Haul cart. There were three of us. We were pulling it. We didn't have any vehicles or any way of pulling it except pulling it along. We didn't have a horse even. So we started out that morning. We went about 4 or 5 miles, but all you could do pulling a cart down there. There was no traffic on the roads. This is another thing that amazed me. No traffic. Back of the American lines, it was like Broadway. Hundreds of vehicles, supply trucks, tanks, vehicles, jeeps, But not in Germany. They were out of fuel and they lost the war partly because of that. So we stopped at a farmhouse and he would ask the lady of the farm to prepare a meal for us. He had an aide, by the way. There were 5 of us. Him and his aide and the 3 of us. And we were guarding. Well, you might think we could try to escape. Well, for a while we were too close to the action to try to escape. And it was dangerous. Besides, so far so good, we're okay. And he said, I will take you to my home. When we get home, I will treat you well. And when the Americans come and capture me, because he'd given up too, he knew the war was over. And by the way, this guy was 10 years older than us, and he'd been in World War I. He was a seasoned soldier. He'd been an officer in World War I. And here he was in World War II, fighting a second war in his lifetime. So we pulled that cart maybe 20 miles for about a week or 2. About the end of the second week, another soldier joined in our little group. We had 5, now we had 6. But the other soldier was an American who was ill. He had diarrhea and he couldn't even hold his food down. The captain decided it was just too much trouble to keep us. So what he did was he turned us over to a marching column of prisoners that Germany was moving south towards Switzerland. We're in the middle of Germany now. And we're going down towards Switzerland. Germany was evacuating all their POW camps. Germany had a lot of camps. They had POW camps. You saw those. There was a famous television comedy about a German POW camp. I can't think of the name of it.
Hogan's Heroes.
Hogan's Heroes, yeah. Remember that? Have you seen any chapters of that? A funny story. The Germans kept pretty good care of captured American, British, French soldiers. They took good care of them. They fed them and treated them well. We knew nothing about the concentration camps or the slave camps that we discovered later. Yes, you have a question?
Why did they treat you guys?
Why? Because they were being captured themselves, and they wanted to prove to the world that they recognized the rules of the Geneva Convention, which outlined the treatment of prisoners of war. As long as you were wearing a uniform and were captured, you were entitled to certain rights, you see. You had to be fed, kept alive, safe, away from the fighting. That's the rules of the World War I Geneva Convention. And Germany respected that because they wanted their prisoners to be treated the same way. And we did treat captured German soldiers who surrendered honorably, if you can call that an honorable thing to do, to surrender. They were sent back to America and they were treated well. So they did that, but they did not. The people that they enslaved were the Jews and the Gypsies and the people who they felt were inferior races. They had a terrible racism going on in Germany in those days.
So they treated them terribly. But the prisoners of war were treated respectfully, as well as they could. But they didn't have a lot of chance to treat Americans or anybody comfortably. We didn't have much food. Anyway, Captain Ortel told us, what I want to do is exchange you for better treatment when I become a prisoner. He was going to make a deal, see? He was an operator. This guy had been an operator all his life. He learned that from being in the military from all these years, see? I'll tell you about that, how he ended up later. But he knew how to take care of himself. So he was going to use us. But finally he decided he couldn't handle it. He just couldn't handle it. So he sent us four, the two Australians, the other American, and me, to a marching prisoner of war camp that was moving south. This column, I said, had over 1,000 men in it. There were Russians, there were Hungarians, there were Greeks, there were British, there were French civilians who had been POW, French soldiers who had been captured. All of these were former enemies of Germany that they'd captured as prisoners. And they kept the Russians up at the front of the column, always. And then came the French, because they were more disciplined. Every time we'd march through a city, they would really straighten us up and ask us to keep step and to look good, you know. The Americans were the least disciplined of all, especially the Air Force. My God, those guys. At the end of the column, the Americans would always break ranks and wander off, try to barter their wristwatches or their extra money for extra food. Give us a couple of potatoes. We'll give you this watch for a couple of eggs. They're always doing that. And the soldiers who were old men, most of them, were trying to herd them back into line to straighten them out. So they looked very undisciplined. I couldn't understand why the Americans could behave themselves better, but they were starving and they were hungry. Anyway, that's the pattern that went on, and we marched south past Nuremberg. I can remember seeing the city of Nuremberg, which is down here. Here's Munich, but it's right up in here. Here's Munich, right here. So we marched from Regensburg down this way, and we were about 5 miles from Nuremberg. I could see it over the bombs. They bombed Nuremberg while we were watching. A couple of soldiers tried to escape. I remember they were shot as they went across the field. So it discouraged us from trying to do it. Till we came down to the Rhine River. Not the Rhine, the Danube. Here's Augsburg. The Danube flows right through here someplace. This doesn't show the rivers, but the Danube River flows up here. And I remember we got to the Danube and there was a Japanese officer standing at the bridge there. I thought, what is this Japanese guy doing here in the middle of Germany during the middle of the war? He must have been sent back as an observer, because Japan was allied with Germany during the war, you know, as was Italy. Italy soon surrendered, was the first to surrender. We were still at war with Japan, of course. But this Japanese general, was watching us as prisoners passing over the river into well, it was still Germany, but it was towards Switzerland. And finally we marched a few more days till we got to a little village that they said, you were going to have to stop here because there's no more room, and all the villages ahead of us are full of POWs. They all marched down into the southern Germany, hoping that the reason they marched them south was they wanted the Red Cross to take care of them. The International Red Cross supplied POWs. They were the only company that was allowed to go into Germany and supply them with food and gifts. So the only communication that POWs had during the war with the outside world was through the not American, but International Red Cross. And that was headed in Switzerland. All those supplies came in through Switzerland, which was a neutral country. Certain countries were neutral in Europe during the war. Do you know which ones they were?
Poland.
Switzerland and
Belgium.
Spain and
Belgium.
Belgium had been captured.
Oh, yeah.
Belgium had been captured, Netherlands had been captured, Sweden had been neutral, Norway had been captured. But Germany used those countries for this purpose, to communicate and to their means of communication with the outside world when they needed something, money or finances and supplies, or if they send their men to other countries for diplomatic reasons. They would send them to Spain, sometimes Portugal. Portugal was also a neutral country. Well, it's a complicated situation politically. We settled down in this little village in southern Germany, and we could hear every night we could hear the guns going in the background. And sometimes machine guns. Of course, if we hear machine guns, they're closer. So we knew the Americans were advancing and following us all the way. But the rules of warfare is to keep the prisoners away from the battle. And that's why Germany was herding us towards the south, away from the battle, so that they wouldn't defy the Geneva Convention rules. One day, I can remember before we reached the city, though, I remember April 12th, because April 12th was the day that Roosevelt died. And the guard was handing us potato soup. Oh, I forgot to tell you about what we ate. Every night when we pulled into a farmhouse, a farmyard, we would be assigned to a barn where we would sleep that night. And the guards would requisition the owners, the women that were left in the farm, to prepare a meal for us. What was that meal? Well, every farm had a big kettle, about this big around diameter. They did their laundry, I think, or something, and they had a fireplace underneath, like a barbecue. They would heat water in this kettle. Well, they would heat the water with a fire that night, and then they would pour a sack of potatoes into the water, dirt and all, just the way they dug out of the ground, you know. And then they would take a can and show it to us. Had meat in it, canned meat. They dumped one can of meat into this big kettle to show that we were getting our protein, you know, in the food. And it was potato soup, Kartoffel soup we called it, German for potato. So every night we got a canteen full of Kartoffel soup and a piece of bread, hard bread. That's all we got to eat. That's all we ate for days. Every night we'd do that and have something to eat. In the morning we had a cup of coffee. It was ersatz coffee, meaning phony coffee, false coffee, made out of herbs or grain of some kind. Tastes like warm Coca-Cola. I can't believe it, what it tasted like. But it was warm and hot. And another piece of bread. That's all we had. So we were marching day after day, about 20 miles a day, south with that kind of food. One day came when the machine gun fire sounded closer. And one morning we woke up and all the guards' rifles had been stacked in a pier in the middle of the square, and the guards had disappeared. They had taken off their uniforms and faded into the civilization, who were they? They were no longer soldiers. They deserted. So we were alone there, just about 100 of us in this little village. The mayor realized what had happened, and he killed a cow or an ox or something and barbecued it. And that night we had a feast. our first real heavy meal for days. Most of us would eat it and throw it up immediately. Couldn't hold it down, you know, because we hadn't eaten solid food for days. And most of us were sick and ailing. I was in pretty good health, so I couldn't eat it either. I couldn't hold it down, but I enjoyed it. It was tasty, wonderful. But we had the same clothes on that we'd been captured in, and same shoes on that we'd been wearing for a month and a half. And I had athlete's foot. I remember that. Hurt, but I could walk. The next morning came, and finally a Jeep pulled up, and it was for